We are a community
formed by the gospel
and sent on God's mission
to love the Lord and our neighbor,
to live out the scriptures,
and move to engage our culture with the gospel of Jesus.
We gather
and we scatter.
We make,
mature,
and multiply disciples.
We are the Village Church.
Happy Sunday, Village Church. Wherever you find yourself this morning, whether you are enjoying a Sunday brunch or wrangling kiddos in your playroom, or you're on the couch in front of your TV in your living room, our hope and our desire is that you are able this morning to lift your hearts to the Lord and worship Him. So please join us in song.
He is my joy, my righteousness.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to a Sunday morning stream from the Village Church. My name is Scott. I'm one of the pastors of the Village, and we want to welcome you to another Scattered Worship video. If you don't know anything about the Village, maybe this is your first time tuning in, or you just don't know a whole lot about us, then we want to just let you know who we are in a nutshell. So we are a community that's been formed by the gospel and is sent on God's mission. And because of that, our aim is to love the Lord and our neighbor, to live out the scriptures, and to move to engage our culture with the gospel of Jesus Christ. So that's who we are. That's what our mission is. And the way that we go about doing that week in and week out here is gathering and scattering. Those are the two rhythms that we have as a church. Usually right now, 10:30 in the morning on Sundays, we'd be gathering together in person at the 210. That's 210 South 2nd Street in the heart of downtown Hamilton, Ohio. We would also be gathering together in person across Butler County in people's homes as community groups. And we would do both of those things so that we could be built up together as disciples. So we could then scatter back out into our neighborhoods, the places that we work, wherever we go to school, wherever we live, work, and play as more faithful and effective servants and missionaries of Jesus. So that's who we are. That's our mission. That's how we would usually go about doing those things. And that obviously looks a little bit different right now because we can't gather together in person. We're doing a lot more scattering these days. However, we still want to invite you to join the family and the mission here of the Village. First and foremost, if you don't know who Jesus is, first you're going to hear more about him this morning. But second, we would love to talk with you more about him. So if you don't know much about God, you have questions about Jesus, you're not sure about the church, then please reach out to us, send us a message. We would love to talk with you more about all of that. Secondly, if you would like to get involved and plugged in more with this particular family of the Village Church, then we would love to hear from you. There are lots of ways to plug in, even though we're not gathering together in person as much anymore. So our community groups are still gathering weekly, albeit virtually throughout the week. Our women's Bible study is still meeting virtually on Friday nights. We still have a men's discipleship group that's actually meeting this Sunday and meets every other Sunday night. They meet virtually as well. We have a Monday night weekly Zoom call with the entire church. So there's lots of ways for you guys to get connected if you're looking to get plugged into the family here. And also, if you want to serve, if you want to contribute in some way, shape, or form, some of our teams are finding creative ways to still be able to build up the body and serve the body, even though things are so different right now. So if you're interested in taking any next step at all towards joining the family or the mission here, we would invite you to go to myvillagechurch.com. That's our website. You can find more information about who we are, what we believe, and also how to get connected. There's plenty of buttons, plenty of forms to fill out to let us know what you would like some more information about, and somebody will follow up with you soon about those things. Additionally, if you would like to give, contribute to the mission, you can also do that online as well through the website or through Realm, which is our kind of internal communication website that we use as a church, and you can sign up for free on our website as well. If you want to find some more information about what's about to happen here this morning, you can also find that at our website. Go to, it's right on the homepage. It's Scattered Worship for May 3rd, 2020. You'll find the order of gathering, like what's about to happen here. You also find the focal passage. You'll find a discipleship guide. You'll find song lyrics. You'll find lots of stuff for just this morning's stream. So check that out. We would encourage you to follow along with us there. So what is going to happen this morning is we're going to pray and sing some songs and just prepare our hearts to hear God's word preached. Pastor Michael is going to continue our sermon series through the book of Exodus, and then we'll have an opportunity at the end of that to respond to whatever it is that the Spirit might be doing in us today, to reflect and repent and respond to his work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Justin and Tanya as they continue to lead us in worship this morning through song.
I will set my hope in your love, oh Lord. to your side, where heaven is real and death is a lie. I wanna hear voices of angels above, singing as one, hallelujah. Holy, holy, God Almighty, great I am, who is worthy, none beside thee, God Almighty, the great I am. I wanna be near to your heart, loving the world and hating the dark. I wanna see dry bones living again, singing as one, hallelujah. Holy, holy, God Almighty, the great I am, who is worthy, none beside thee, God Almighty, the great I am. Sing the mountains. The mountains shake before him, the demons run and flee. At the mention of your name, King of majesty, there is no power in hell or any who can stand before the power and the presence of the great I am. 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 Hallelujah. Holy, holy, God Almighty, the great I am, who is worthy, none beside thee, God Almighty, the great I am. Sing the mountains. The mountains shake before him, the demons run and flee. At the mention of your name, King of majesty, there is no power in hell or any who can stand before the power and the presence of the great I am. 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 Hallelujah. Holy, holy, God Almighty, the great I am, who is worthy, none beside thee, God Almighty, the great I
Hey everybody, today's focal passage is Exodus 14, 1 to 31. It's a long one, so hang in there. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. In front of Baal-zephon you shall encamp facing it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord," and they did so. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people, and they said, "What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" So he made ready his chariot and took his army with him, and took 600 chosen chariots, and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them and camped by the sea, by Pi-hahiroth in front of Baal-zephon. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. The people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." And Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." The Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff, and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, so that they shall go in after them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, his chariots, and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." Then the angel of God who was going before the host of Israel moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And there was the cloud and the darkness, and it lit up the night without one coming near the other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went in after them in the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning watched the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud look down on the Egyptian forces, and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and upon their horsemen." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen. Of all the hosts of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning. Hey all, Michael here, one of the pastors of the village. Thanks so much for hanging out with us. Just a quick note, I know things are difficult, and I know that as the days and weeks and months go on in kind of self-isolation and quarantine stuff, it's difficult. And so I hope that this time together serves you well. I know it serves me, and I love getting to see different faces. And man, I long for the day that we can come together and worship together as one body in spirit and flesh, and I hope you do as well. So we have a ton to get to today in Exodus 14, the whole chapter, and so let's just jump in. There is a movie called The Matrix, and it's a trilogy, started in the late 90s, spilled over into the early 2000s, and whether you've seen that before or if you've not seen that, there's no way I could explain it to you because I don't really understand it myself. But the idea is there's a lot going on that most people don't see the reality of. There's this guy named Morpheus, and he knows kind of the ins and outs, and he knows what's going on. There's this guy named Neo, and he's kind of new to the Matrix and understanding what is real. And so Morpheus is teaching Neo what's real, what is true. And just kind of the idea that whatever you thought was real, man, those assumptions probably aren't quite accurate. Morpheus says to Neo at one point, he says this. He says, the Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us, even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. And Neo says, what truth? And Morpheus says, that you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, into a prison that you cannot taste or see or touch, a prison for your mind. Now look, you may not realize this, but you're not living in the Matrix. That's not what I was going to say. You may not realize this, but truth may not be what you think it is either. You too were born a slave. In the Bible, through the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Romans in chapter 6, verse 16 and following, he helps us understand what I mean by that. He says, do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey? And then he gives two options. He says either sin, which leads to death. That's the result, that's the wage of sin, or obedience, which leads to righteousness, and which means right before God. But thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed. And having been set free from sin, you have become slaves of righteousness. Two options: slave to sin, slave to righteousness. Those who are slaves to righteousness, you once walked in as a slave to sin. Those are the only two options. And so some still walk in slavery to sin, and others who trust Jesus are free to walk in righteousness. To be a slave means that you are walking towards a path that leads to death. To be a slave to sin leads to death. To be a slave to righteousness means that you're walking on a path that leads to life and flourishing, even in this life, not only in the next. Because sin is rebellion against the origin of what is good, and the origin of good is God. Because sin is rebellion against God, it dismisses God, and it shows up in a million different ways on the surface, right? But to be a slave to righteousness is to be liberated and to be freed to follow and to be free to obey what is good, to obey God. Later on, Neo, as he's kind of learning about this slavery and the Matrix and all this stuff, he says, why are my eyes so... And Morpheus interrupts him. He says, because you've never used them before. And the reality is, many of us walk around blind, not understanding that we are slaves to sin, but God's grace, it overwhelms us so that we might see. The problem is, we don't always see. and some never do. And others, they lay aside, they cast off their lenses and they put back on the old lenses, fighting for what they might call freedom because it's familiar. So we fight for the life of sin that we once had because it's familiar, but really it's a slavery which leads to death. So as we're looking at Exodus, and this is our 18th sermon in Exodus. We just have a few more until we'll take a long break through this series, Captive Set Free. Today we see the apex of God's power and His rescue for His people, for all of God's people, up until the point where Jesus hangs on the cross. This chapter is the climax of God's hand to rescue, to save His people. So there are many connections that we see in this to the life that Jesus offers us. But about this passage, the Red Sea, there are more songs and more psalms and more references throughout the scriptures and in Jewish history to the Red Sea than nearly every other aspect and act of God. It is His definitive rescue and redemption. And here's the thing, it's brutal, which puts on display the lengths that God must go to liberate His people from their cruel master. The big idea is even when all seems lost, God saves His people by His great power according to His perfect plan. So, we're in Exodus 14, the whole chapter, and the setup. There's so much here that we can't hit on, but the setup goes like this. There's a lot going on. They had left Egypt. God had pulled His people out after generations of slavery and captivity at the hand of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. He pulls the Hebrews out through a series of plagues and strikes against Pharaoh, and finally Pharaoh says, "All right, go, get out of here. We don't want to see you again." And so they leave so that they might go worship God. That is the scene. But then Pharaoh gets this idea to go after them. He regrets that, and he kind of binds them in. And then God delivers to save His people in some crazy, miraculous ways. And just for those of you who kind of want to figure out the scene here, it's probably a couple weeks up to maybe like 25 days that this whole thing has kind of unfolded. So they've probably been away for less than a month and more than a few weeks. And so as you're trying to put together a timeline. So 3 points in this. Again, a lot to get through. The first one is this: God liberates with calculated precision. Okay? Let's jump right in. Verse 1 in chapter 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of some places." And He says, "You shall encamp facing it by the sea, for Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, and the wickedness has shut them in. And the wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord." And they did so. So that's kind of what's going on here. Turn around, backpedal a little bit. Remember, they're following a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. And they're following Moses, who's kind of this intermediate between God and God's people. And so you just imagine that the cloud backtracks and Moses is saying, "Come on, guys." And they're kind of like, huh? This doesn't make any sense. But God tells us why He does this. He does this so that Pharaoh will think that you've lost your mind and he will try to attack you. And why would I want that to happen? So that I will get my glory. We see this throughout the scriptures, that God is about His own glory. We who live in light of Him, who are saved by grace through faith in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, we too get to live for the glory of God. We're best that way. We are made to worship and to praise and to glorify Him. But it might seem off-putting why would God be about His own glory? And I won't spend a ton of time here, but there is one who can seek His own glory because He isn't boasting falsely, right? God seeks his own glory. It isn't posturing when God works for his glory, because he is the only one that isn't arrogant. He's not arrogant. He doesn't embellish. He doesn't exaggerate the numbers. He doesn't exaggerate his power or his strength. He is magnificent and he is good. God in three persons, each exalting the other from eternity past to eternity future. And so then we move on, and there's kind of this next chunk. And when I was in college, freshman year in college, Kim and I were living in Tennessee, and we had worked the summer before. We saved up some money. We were working, Kim was like working in the library a few hours a week. Other than that, we weren't working, and so we were kind of just living off of the money that we had saved in the summer. One weekend, we went with Kim's roommate. We went to the mall down in Chattanooga, and we were enticed to buy some Doc Martens. Each of us, right? 3 pairs of Doc Martens. The shoe salesman, he was a young guy. He was pumped, right? Because it made him some commission money. So we get back to campus. The next day at breakfast, we're talking about it. None of us wore them. The next day at lunch, we're like, yeah, man, gosh, we probably spent, they were like $100 and something at that time. We probably spent a tenth of our money that we had to live on for 9 months, on a pair of shoes. And so we had buyer's remorse. And so we went back, heads hung low, and we gave that guy his commission back. And so we took those shoes back. Pharaoh and the Egyptians, they don't have buyer's remorse. They have seller's remorse. They find themselves regretting that they ever sent the Hebrews away. I imagine that Pharaoh, he's making decisions. He lacks judgment in many ways. And so he says, fine, just get out of here. I can't take this anymore. But then he begins to think, gosh, this is going to impact our economy because there are millions of Hebrews making bricks for us. Now we have to have our own people make bricks. How are we going to do that? And then he probably began to think, was God really that powerful? What's going on here? He began to think, what are people going to think when this huge tribe of Hebrews are wandering out, and when our enemies see them, are they going to think that they defeated us, or that I'm weak? And so they begin to have this kind of remorse, and so he turns, he makes a hard shift, and he sends the cavalry, all the king's horses and all the king's men, and he sends 600 chariots, which just for context is way more than should have been sent in a normal military kind of act in this context. And so they encamp around the Hebrews, and they back them into an alley. I think of movies a lot when I'm looking at this, and you just think of a chase scene and a guy running, and he runs into an alley and there's no way out, and he looks up and, we got you. And so that's kind of the scene. There's no way out. You imagine the music crescendos as the impending doom is there, and that's the way that as Moses writes this, he wants us to feel the weight, that there was no escape for them as this happens. There's probably a sweat on Moses' eyebrow, and just fear in the lives of the men, women, and children. Jackie Chan, as great of an escape artist as he is, he could not escape this alley, right? And so there's no hope. And then I think of movies like Ocean's 11 or the Bourne series, where you have this mastermind of details, and you just have this, the good guys are just one step ahead of the bad guys, and it's a complex web of plans. That's what's happening here. There's a mastermind of details. We see God's hand working in the details of life and liberation. And to be clear, He does not save His people by accident. He didn't do that here. He does not do that in our life in Christ. He does not leave salvation to chance. And make no mistake at all, God is the author of salvation. The Scriptures sing this praise time and time again. That's true for the Hebrews. That's true for the masses. And listen, that's true for me, and that's true for you. I don't know about you, but it's easy to think sometimes that God kind of sets things in motion and then he just backs off, and he just lets things go, and one day he'll come back and he'll fix it all again. And on one hand, I do think that God gives an incredible amount of freedom in the way that we live our lives. He does give us an incredible amount of freedom in the decisions that we make. As the proverb tells us in 19:21, it says, "Many are the plans in the mind of a man." And so that affirms that truth, that man makes plans, and that is okay, and we get to follow in those plans, and we get to act according to those things. We get to set our course as we may. But on the other hand, God presses all things forward, right? He presses all things forward. Everything is subject to the plans of God. In the second half of that proverb, it says this, "Many are the plans in the mind of man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand." God is not void of strategy, right? He is strategic in all that he does, and that doesn't mean that he asks for our opinion. Now you can be upset about that, and you can consider that God thinks and he acts, and he knows, he's privy to information that you're not, that you don't know, or you can rest in that and you can follow him because he alone is God. I know that there are many people who look at the government, and in the U.S. we look at the federal government, or even the state government, the local government, like even your work, and you know that there are meetings maybe higher than you that are happening, and what we do is we assume and we speculate that they know something that we don't, and therefore they are working for themselves against us, right? And look, this is not a political statement. I'm not making a timely political statement. You can think whatever you want to think about any of that stuff, but here's the thing. This is not a political statement. It's a theological statement. We do this because we know that humanity is corrupt. We know that the hearts of man, the reality is we know that they are slaves to sin. We know that they seek themselves, that they build themselves up. And so humanity is corrupt. But to think that God is somehow undermining, or he's leading you to miss out on the fullness of life, as maybe the Egyptians might have thought in this moment, because he doesn't reveal every detail of all the things for all time, or even every detail about you. He knows you better than you do. I promise you that. Okay? And so when we ascribe this understanding, humanity's corrupt, government and employers or whatever, they know something that we don't, and that means it's at our expense. When we apply that to God, it is to bite the same fruit that Adam and Eve bit when they failed to trust God in the garden and they were duped by the serpent. It's the same thing. It's to mistrust that God does not have our best interest in mind. And hear me, God is about his people, and he is about his glory, and he's about his people living for his glory, because that's how we were designed to live. That's how we flourish together in community. That's how we will flourish to the ends of this earth, in the new heavens and the new earth for all of eternity. So God, he led the Hebrews in a way that would position them exactly where they needed to be. That was the point, to entice Pharaoh and his spies, or however he was kind of looking at the Hebrews and figuring out what they were doing, to entice them to think that they had no clue what they were doing, that they were wandering about. As one translation says, the wilderness hath shut them in. That's what Pharaoh sees. That's what God wanted them to see. And the final destruction of Israel's enemy was calculated. And I am confident that God has been at work in your life, and there are times when it didn't make sense. That might be right now. That you might consider that God's at work, And you might just say, this doesn't make sense to me what God is up to. That is okay. We must know that it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. And we must know that He stands against the hard-hearted opposer, but He delights in the humble who turns toward Him. So we get to do, what we get to do is we get to submit to God. We get to submit to God alone, who is God. There is only one. And we get to trust His calculated plan to move and to rescue. God works with calculated precision. The second thing is this. God's freedom comes at a cost. I was talking to a friend this week. Maybe you know him. Josh Santos. Hey, Josh. What up? Hey, Kristen. Hey, Ezra. What up? And he said this. He said, everyone wants to lead themselves, but once they get the chance to, they're pretty bad at it. Right? Everyone wants to lead themselves, but once they get the chance to, they're pretty bad at it. Unlike us, the upside that Egypt had for the hearts of Israel was that they could see their enemy. They could see what and who they were slave to. And that still didn't allow their hearts to find the gift of freedom a worthwhile gift. Let's read on in verse 11. I'll start in verse 10. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. Again, we see this theme of fear show up all throughout this stuff. They feared Egypt more than they feared God. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians." See, they're wanting slavery for themselves. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians to die. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. And Moses said to the people, and this is like a faith-filled, faith-fueled response. He says, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." Gosh, fear not, he says, relax. And that's not, I don't think that is a rebuke. I think when he says don't fear, that's a comfort for them to rest in the Lord's work, right? What they were slave to, Pharaoh in Egypt, was a better option for them than the unknown of following God wherever He leads. Now, they say that out loud, but aren't each of our beliefs even better identified by what we do than what we say? So you might say, I would never say that. And maybe that's true, but you might live as if that were true. Not only does God save His people from the outside and from the enemy without, the enemy around them, but time and time again, in fact, it is the nature in which He saves. He saves us from ourselves. Imagine the scene. Enslaved, right, by a violent tyrant nation and a relatively just kind of a psycho, frantic Pharaoh. The demand was high. When they were in Egypt, they were wrung of their identity, and they became, their identity was servant to serve, and that was it. They're freed in a visibly miraculous way by God's leadership through the plagues, through Moses' leadership. They're being guided by a pillar of cloud and by a pillar of fire to lead, and they're followed that leadership, that cloud and Moses, to a dead-end alley. Understandably, all hope seems lost. They can trust God and see that He has been nothing but faithful to this point, or they can blame and they complain. They choose the latter. They forsake trust and they blame and they complain. So what about you? How do you respond in situations like this? A couple things. They were mindful of what they were giving up. They knew what they were leaving. I remember when I was like considering following Jesus. And I remember looking at my life and I remember saying out loud, and it was probably a brand of theology that I was looking at things through, that I wouldn't say that these would be the most foundational questions that I would ask today. But I remember thinking, man, I'm going to have to give up listening to the music that I listen to. Like I thought, for me, that was the thing that I was like worried about. I'm probably going to have to use different words than I use in my normal life. That's what I thought. Man, now I know that what God was leading me to was so much greater than that, and He undid me in much greater ways. Then the second thing is there's pressure. The pressure that brings the worst out in them, it brings the worst out in us. Pressure brings the worst to the surface, and so I think of just a real practical example of like running late. When we run late, I'll speak for myself, I have very little patience. If someone else is making me late, someone else in my household is making me late to my thing, then man, it causes me to blame and complain. So we can do that, or we can not. All this, it points us to another time when when hopes were high, but in a matter of moments, all seemed lost. Jesus. He said He was the way to life and to freedom, and people uprooted their lives and they followed Him. His disciples did. And they lived with Him for several years towards the end of His life. And then Jesus died. Jesus died. He died on the cross. They watched Him die. And they thought, how can this be the King? How can this be God? How can this be the one who forgives sins? How can this be the one worthy of me uprooting my life, the life that I had, and following Him to a new life? What a disappointment. And on one hand, why can't you just trust God and follow Him? Why couldn't Israel do that? They'd seen Him act time and time again. Why couldn't the disciples do that? They'd seen the miracles that Jesus had performed. They'd seen all of that stuff. They heard Him. They even heard Him tell that He was going to have to die. But they just didn't believe it. The reality is God prevails against Egypt to save His people. And God prevails against death to give life. God saves. Sometimes I forget that. It's been helpful for me this week to sit in this reality that God saves. We never get to move past that. And He doesn't just save universally. He saves people. Sure, He saves His people for His own glory. But He saves personally. He has done that for many who are listening to me right now. And look, if He's not done that, if you've never come to the end of yourself, where you say, you know what, I want to forsake my sin. I want to be forgiven for my sin. And I want to no longer live for my own glory, but I want to live for God's glory here and now and forever. And the only way that we can do that is to trust Jesus, that His death on the cross, Him dying a sinner, allows us to be forgiven for our sin. Man, He will still do that. God saves universally. He saves personally, and I don't mean He saves everyone in the universe, but on the masses scale He saves. But He saves us, and He would desire to save you even today. As an activity and maybe a kind of an application, I know some of you journal, some of you don't. Consider a couple things, and maybe it's just sitting on the porch in prayer later tonight or tomorrow morning, or maybe it's writing in a journal. Consider a couple questions. One is this: what has God saved me from? Write it down. Chase it out. Follow your life out if God had never intervened and opened your eyes so that you might see that you are a slave to sin. Follow it down. See what path that would have led you on. And the second thing is, I continue to follow where He leads, what would God continue to desire to save me from? Like, the reality is, sin is at hand, right? It's close behind, and we have an enemy who seeks to destroy us. So what we get to do is we get to consider where we might be tempted and what sin we might be enticed by, and we get to remember that God wants to save us from that as well. And then, man, just write a prayer of thanks. Just thank God for what He's saved you from, what He desires to continue to save you from, and that He might continue to do that. The reality is, though, sometimes that salvation isn't as welcomed as we might think, and certainly not as welcomed as it should be. Jesus, He challenges His followers. He says, follow me, but before you do that, count the cost. We can't follow God without counting the cost. We can't follow God and also rule and reign in our own way. We can't continue to be God and follow God at the same time. So we position our hearts to follow, and then we no longer get to pick and choose what part of the scriptures that we follow, but we get to walk in a way that is led by God and His Word. There's this theme in the scriptures, and it goes like this. It's the old man is dead and the new man has come. And that's a picture of the life that we once lived and the life that we live in Christ now. The old man, he doesn't die easy. The battle is to believe that we are being saved for something that is better than what we are being saved from. That's the challenge that the Hebrews are facing in this moment. That God is a better king than any other throughout any time, for any reason, for all of creation, or He isn't. We see Israel, they seem to reject this when the going gets tough. They want to revert back. They long for the good old days of when they were slaves to Egypt, and we might long for the good old days when we were slaves to our sin. For those who have been rescued, the old man is dead. He died when you put your faith into a dead Jesus on the cross. He died by faith, and He dies, that old man dies every time we believe and we align our hearts to take up our cross. The new man, he lives by faith, but it's as if he is reaching from the grave to try to capture us, our hearts, our mind, our life, and our freedom. So Moses' response, it demonstrates a true transformation in the life of Moses from the shaky, weak, faithless Mo of old. The reality is sin wants you slave to its demand. Don't fall for it. Do not fall for that. So as John Owen says, we be killing sin lest it be killing us. So the call seems to be for us to rise up, to take arms, to fight against our sin. And we do fight. And we must wage war moment by moment, day by day. But the war is not like you think that it is. The war is against doubt and disbelief because, as Moses says, the Lord will fight for you and you have only to be silent. Fear not. Be silent. Let the victory that God secures for us lead us to victory. Do you believe that? Because the Lord is near. And this is point 3. And God saves by His mighty hand. Verse 15, the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward, lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. That's crazy. That doesn't make any sense. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, his chariots and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots and his horsemen. God saves by His mighty hand. God is putting His devotion and His power on display. And look, if you're just tuning in, maybe for the first time in this series, what happens, it sounds brutal. And if you've been tracking with us for a while, this still sounds brutal. It is brutal. Make no mistake that sin is deadly. And I will not belabor this third point that God saves by His mighty hand. But this is a rescue and a tale of deadly peril. Sin brings forth death every single time to every single one. Its natural result is destruction. The ruler of sin is Satan, and he aims to steal and kill and destroy. That's Satan's anthem. That is the power of darkness at work against us. Death is imminent. The only escape is to trust one, to stand in the gap between your enemy and you. And maybe you think yourself brave and you think, man, I would volunteer as tribute for the ones that I love to stand in the gap. But you forget, you aren't free to volunteer because you have your own debt to pay. Your debt and your wage is death because of the sin that you've leveraged in your rebellion against God. And here's the other thing, that we're not asking one to just save his friends, but there is one who died, who stood in the gap that he might save his enemies as well. There is one who can touch the heavens by his relationship with God in perfect righteousness, who being God took the form of a man. He also touches humanity in His incarnation and His flesh, and His name is Jesus. Go back to Morpheus and Neo for a second. Morpheus says to Neo, there are these agents and they're coming in and they're opposing the good guys for all intents and purposes. And he says, sooner or later, someone is going to have to fight them. Every single man or woman who has stood their ground, everyone who has fought them has died. But where they have failed, Neo, you will succeed. And what we find out is Neo is the one. He is the rescuer. And we get to catch a glimpse of the real one, Jesus, and His future work as we conclude this text. And it goes like this. Then the angel of God, who was going before the host of Israel, moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And there was the cloud and the darkness, and it lit up the night without one coming near the other all night. What we see is that God stands in the gap between our enemy and ourselves. That's what Jesus does. And then as we read on, it's just as God described, that Moses holds up his staff and the waters part, and it's not this immediate thing. There are potentially millions of people here, and the Hebrews, they follow along and they walk on dry land as the east wind and the west wind holds the waters up, and they walk through, and Pharaoh looks and he says, after them. He goes after them, and God crashes the water down, and it destroys the enemy. And just before that, we see that the Egyptians, they go into a panic, and their wheels of their chariots get clogged, and they're saying, "Get out of here! Let us flee from Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand," and the sea fell upon them, and the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen of all the host of Pharaoh that followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained, but the people of Israel, they walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, so that the people feared the Lord right? See how their fear shift when they see God's power and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. At the Red Sea, it's God's power over creation that crushes his enemy, even in the fine-tuning of this scene at the cross. It's God's power to humbly walk to death for charges not his own. What a great God we serve. So let us believe this even when all seems lost. God saves his people by his great power according to his perfect plan. And let that belief spur us to reflect upon that. So we'll throw some questions on the screen that we might reflect, repent, and respond. And I invite you to continue reflecting and repenting and responding as we sing together. See you soon.
When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. Though Satan should buffet, though trial should come, let this blessed assurance control, that Christ has regarded my helpless estate and has shed his own blood for my soul. My sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious thought. My sin, not in part, but the whole, is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, oh my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. And Lord, haste the day when my faith shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, the trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul.
Thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. I have a couple things that I want to share with you, but before I do, we want to just highlight our groups. Actually, not just this week, but throughout the month of May. We want to take just a couple of minutes and talk about the importance of gathering together in community. And we want to hear from some different people within the village and get their perspective on things. So today, before I talk about anything else, I want to hand it over to Ben and Lindsay Brashear, and they're going to share just a little bit about leading a community group here at the village.
Hey, Village Church. I'm Ben Brashear. This is my wife, Lindsay Brashear, and we lead the Lindenwald Community Group.
We're both definitely introverted, and we're more behind the scenes people, but we really enjoyed our group too, and we didn't want to leave. But after the sermon one day, Scott got up and asked if anyone was interested in leading a group. And I felt compelled to say yes, and I didn't think that he would want to, but when we talked about it in the car on the way home, he said, yes, we should. So we went ahead and talked to Scott that day.
So we talked to Scott about potentially leading a community group. We talked to our group that we were in at the time about leading a group, and everybody seemed to be excited, probably because we were leaving, but hopefully because just because we were expanding. We were wanting to kind of set out another branch to reach another area for people to gather and go over the focal passage and things like that.
It's not as heavy as we thought it would be, and it's not eyes on us, but more eyes on Christ. It's not so much teaching, but more facilitating a fruitful conversation about the sermon that we had before. Community is definitely a two-way street. It works both ways. It shouldn't just be us chasing our group or our group chasing us for attention. It's a mutual thing. It shouldn't be a burden. It's something that we get to do, and it should be life-giving and not just a task to check off the list. And community, it doesn't look like a bunch of the same people walking the same life. It should look like God's community, which is global in all walks of life. So if you are feeling the desire to join a group or lead a group, just reach out to Scott. Thanks.
Thanks, Brashears. So a couple things before you all head out. First, if you are interested in learning a little bit more about the village, if you're curious about membership at all, or if you're dead set on becoming a member of the village, then we would love to invite you to our next Village Gate. The Village Gate is a class that we usually have a couple times a year, and during that time we let you know just some of the basics of the faith, but then also some of the things that make us tick. What's at the core of the village? What makes us distinct? What do we believe? How do we go about doing what we do? Why do we do what we do? All sorts of things. That gives you a good idea of who we are, and it also gives us an opportunity to learn who you are as well. Now, the Village Gate can't happen like it usually has in the past because we can't all be in the same room together. So that's a little tough, but we're going to do a virtual Village Gate. Now, if you are interested in doing that, there is a post on our website and on Realm where you can click on a link to fill out a form to let us know that you want to be a part of that. We're not sure what all that's going to look like in a digital format, but we're figuring that out, and we would love to figure that out with you. So fill out that form, and we'll circle back with whoever's interested in being part of that to figure out a day and a time for us to get together and have those conversations. So let us know if you are interested. Secondly, we have men's discipleship tonight. Usually it's tries to be the second and fourth Sunday of the month because of Mother's Day. They're doing at least the first Sunday of the month in May. So tonight at 7 p.m. Is our bi-weekly men's discipleship gathering. So men, we'd love to see you join in on that conversation. And then lastly, tomorrow night, Monday night at 8:15 p.m., we have our all-church Zoom call. Last week was super fun. The Knutsons let us in a game night. I'm not sure at the time of recording this what we're doing the following week, tomorrow night, but hopefully it'll be a good time as well. Check out details for that on Realm. That should be posted sometime in the next 24 hours. Before you go, I want to send you all out with a benediction. That's a good word. Feel free to raise your hand in affirmation of it. As you go, and even when all seems lost, remember that God saves his people by his great power according to his perfect plan. Grace and peace with you all. Love you and miss you.